The morning after I disobeyed my husband, he came downstairs before I had finished setting the table. He did not raise his voice. He did not touch me. He pulled out his chair, sat down, and said 4 words before I had even set his coffee cup in front of him. "They will go elsewhere." I did not understand. I asked him what he meant. He looked at his plate. He did not answer. He ate his breakfast, put on his hat, and walked out to the barn. It was 3 weeks before I understood what those 4 words meant. 3 weeks of trying to make myself smaller, quieter, more obedient, more invisible. 3 weeks of watching my children's faces at supper, counting them around the table, touching their hair when they passed me in the kitchen, learning how to hold something in your chest that has no name and no cure. And when I finally understood what was coming, I sat down on the kitchen floor with my back against the cold wall, and I did not cry. I had already cried everything out. What was left was something else, something I carried for 31 years before I found a word for it. Stay with me, because what I am about to tell you about what Amish husbands were permitted to take from a disobedient wife is going to change how you understand obedience and authority and the kind of silence that gets passed down from mother to daughter like a piece of china. My name is Anna. I grew up Old Order Amish in Geauga County, Ohio. I married at 22. I left when I was 53, and by then I had grandchildren who did not know my face. This channel, Hannah the Amish Girl, is where I finally say the things my community would never allow me to say out loud. If you want to hear the truths that were buried for generations, please subscribe right now and tap the like button, and drop your country in the comments. I read every single one, because every single one matters to me. Now let me explain something that took me a long time in therapy to be able to say plainly. In Old Order Amish communities, marriage is not a partnership in any sense that the outside world would recognize. It is an institution with a clear order of authority, and that order was never hidden. It was preached from the bench every other Sunday. It was woven into the Ordnung, the code of rules that governed every hour of our lives, and it was enforced not by shouting, not usually, but by something quieter and more thorough than shouting. The theology was built on a hierarchy that did not negotiate. God first, the bishop, the deacon, the ministers, then the husband, and then the wife. Her role was defined not by what she could do, but by what she could not refuse. She could not refuse her husband's authority over the home. She could not refuse the bishop's rulings on her behavior. She could not refuse the counsel of the church. And in the version of this theology I lived inside, refusal was not simply a personal failing. It was a spiritual one. Disobedience was not a bad choice. It was hochmut, pride, the gravest sin the Amish recognize. And hochmut in a wife did not only endanger her soul, it endangered the order of the entire household. I want you to understand how completely that word, hochmut, was used to seal every exit. When I felt something was wrong, that was hochmut. When I asked a question that had no approved answer, that was hochmut. When I wanted something for my daughter that the church had not sanctioned, that was hochmut. The word did not describe a sin. It described a woman who was thinking for herself. And thinking for yourself in that world was the most dangerous thing a wife could do, because it was contagious. A wife who thought for herself might raise daughters who thought for themselves. And that, to the men who held authority in my community, was not a family problem. It was a theological emergency. Here is what people outside the community rarely understand. The tools available to a husband when his wife disobeyed were not written anywhere I ever read. There was no document, no list, no rule that said, "These are the consequences available to you." And yet every woman in my community knew exactly what they were. We knew them the way you know a fence line you have walked since childhood. You do not need it written down. You already know where it ends. A husband could restrict where his wife went, not dramatically, not with chains or locked doors, but quietly. He stopped telling her when the neighbors were visiting. He arranged that she was needed at home when the quilting bee met. He spoke to her father about her state of mind, and her father spoke to her, and the message arrived softly, as if from concern. A husband could control what she handled, money she never saw the shape of anyway, but there were smaller things. The letter she was expecting from her sister arrived, and when she asked about it, he said he had not seen it. A husband could manage her standing. In a community where your entire life exists inside a circle of perhaps 300 people, what those people think of you is not reputation. It is oxygen. He could say the right things in the right places and alter how the air moved around her without her ever knowing he had spoken. And a husband who had the bishop's ear, and mine did, could do one thing more, something older than any written rule, something I had heard whispered about but believed, the way children believe in things they hope are not true, was a story from another time. He could separate a wife from her children, not with a court order, not with papers. The English world had papers and courts and lawyers. We had the bishop. We had the church. We had the understanding, unspoken, absolute, that a disobedient wife was an unfit influence on children who still needed to be formed in the faith. The children belonged to the household. The household was the husband's responsibility. If the wife's spirit was disordered, if she was showing her children that a wife could resist, that a woman could disagree and hold her ground, she was not protecting them. She was infecting them. I want to be careful here because the details of what I disobeyed belong to a longer telling. The short version is this. I refused to allow my youngest daughter, who was 14, to leave school for full home duties before her mind was ready. That was my disobedience. I said no. My husband brought it to the bishop. The bishop came to our home, and I said no again, sitting at my own kitchen table with my hands flat on the wood, and my voice as steady as I could hold it. That was when my husband said I was not thinking clearly. That was when the bishop agreed that perhaps distance from the daily pressures of the household would help me find my way back to obedience. There is a word for what came next, but I did not know it for 30 years. Over 11 Sundays, things shifted. My oldest son stopped meeting my eyes at the table. My 2 middle daughters began taking instruction from their father about tasks they had always come to me for. The youngest, the one I had fought for, was moved to her aunt's household down the road for what was called a rest period for the family. I was told this was temporary. I was told this was for her benefit. I was told that when I demonstrated a restored spirit, things would return to normal. I cooked every meal. I did every washing. I sat at the same table. And I became, without anyone announcing it, a woman who was there and not there at the same time. The 3rd Sunday, my middle daughter asked her father whether she should use the good tablecloth for visiting day. She did not ask me. She was standing 4 feet from where I was standing. She turned to him. I watched her do it the way you watch something happen that you cannot stop and cannot look away from. The 4th Sunday, my son passed me in the hallway without speaking, not with anger, not even with intention. I do not think he knew he had done it. That was what frightened me most. Not that they were being told to turn away from me, but that turning away from me was already becoming normal, something that required no instruction. By the 7th Sunday, I understood that what was happening was not a punishment with an end date. It was a slow rewriting of who I was in that house. And by the 11th Sunday, the rewriting was nearly finished. My neighbor Ruth was the only person who spoke to me plainly during those weeks. She was 60. Her husband had died the winter before, and she had nothing left to lose by honesty. She came to my fence one afternoon while I was hanging sheets, and she said, not looking at me, "This is how it is done. They do not take them all at once. That would look cruel. They take them one Sunday at a time until you come back." I asked her what coming back meant. She said, "It means they never see you say no again." She did not say it with bitterness. That was what stayed with me. She said it the way you state something that has simply always been true, the way you might tell a child that winter comes after fall. She had watched it happen before. She had perhaps lived her own version of it, and she had survived by coming back and spent the rest of her years knowing exactly what that survival had cost her. I did not ask her that. I did not need to. It was in her voice. It was in the way she kept her eyes on the sheets and did not once look at my face. I did not come back. My youngest daughter was at her aunt's home for 4 months. 2 of my other children were formally placed with my husband's brother's family the following spring for what was called a season of settling. By the time I understood that this was not temporary, that the season had no scheduled end, my 2 oldest had married, and my middle daughters were so accustomed to the new arrangement that they came to me on visiting days with a kind of careful politeness, the way you are polite to someone you love, but are not allowed to agree with. I want you to understand something about my husband. He was not a monster in the way that word sounds. He had been raised to believe that what he was doing was restoration, that he was protecting the order of his household, and by extension, his children's souls. He could not have explained the damage he was causing, because in his framework there was no damage. There was only a wife who had broken the order, and a husband returning it. That does not excuse it, but it explains how a quiet man with steady hands and a reputation for fair dealing can hollow out a family without ever once raising his voice. I found a therapist 12 years after I left. She was the first person outside the Amish world who heard the full account. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something I have thought about every week since. She said, "What you are describing is coercive control. It does not require violence. It requires only that one person controls the resources another person cannot survive without. For you, those resources were your children. I had not had a word for it. 31 years without a word for it. And then I had one, and it cracked something open in my chest that I am still, all these years later, learning to breathe through. What happened over the next 11 Sundays? I cannot carry it in 20 minutes. There are things this recording cannot hold: the names, the counting, the drawer, the dress I kept for 27 years. 3 years ago, I wrote it all down. The book is called The Sundays. The link is in the description and the pinned comment. I want to speak now to what the Old Order theology said about all of this, because I think it is important not to leave it unnamed. The Ordnung never said a husband could take his children from his wife. It did not need to say it. What it said was that a wife who persisted in hochmut was placing her entire household in spiritual danger, and what the bishops understood and what the community understood, without it ever being spoken plainly, was that the children of a disobedient woman needed to be shielded from her disobedience. The theology did not create monsters. It created a framework in which ordinary people could do devastating things and believe with their whole hearts that they were being faithful. My daughter, the youngest, the one I had fought for, found me when she was 29. She had left by then. She drove to the town where I was living and knocked on my door on a Wednesday afternoon in November, and I stood in the doorway and looked at her face, which was my mother's face, which was my face, and I did not know what to say. She said, "I know what you did. I know why." We stood there in the cold for a long time. I had not touched my daughter's hair in 15 years. I put my hand on the side of her face, and she closed her eyes. We have been rebuilding for 11 years. It is not the same as what we lost, and I do not think it will ever be. But it is real, and it is ours, and no bishop can touch it. Since I left, I have learned that what happened in my marriage was not unusual in the way I believed it was unusual. I believed for a long time that I had suffered something exceptional, something that happened because of the specific shape of my husband and the specific reach of my bishop. But I have spoken to other women, Old Order women, Swartz and Truber women, women from communities in Pennsylvania and Ohio and Indiana. And what I have learned is that the removal of children from a disobedient wife was not a rare punishment. It was a known instrument. It was one of the last tools in a sequence of tools. And most women never got that far because the tools before it worked. The information gap, the financial control, the management of standing, the quiet reconfiguration of loyalty. Most women came back long before it reached the children. One woman I spoke to, she was from a Swartz and Truber community in eastern Ohio, stricter than mine in every way, told me that in her district they had a name for the sequence. Not an official name, a kitchen name, the kind of thing women said to each other in low voices when the men were not nearby. They called it the narrowing, because that is what it felt like. Not a sudden taking, a slow narrowing of the space you were permitted to exist in, until the space was so small that you could only stand perfectly still, and call that standing still obedience, and call your obedience peace. She had come back. She told me this without shame and without apology. She said, "I had 6 children. What was I supposed to do?" I did not have an answer for her. I still do not. But I think about her often, and I think about the 6 children who grew up watching their mother make herself smaller every year, and I wonder what they learned from that, what the daughters carried, what the sons believed. I was stubborn. I had always been stubborn, and the women in my family had always called it something softer, persistence or steadiness or faith. My husband called it pride. The bishop called it a disordered spirit. My therapist called it the thing that saved my life. She was right. If I had come back, if I had folded my hands and said yes, and let my daughter leave school without a full season of her mind's formation, I would still be there. Or I would be a woman who had survived by learning not to be herself anymore. I have known both kinds of women. I have held their hands at quilting bees and sat beside them at funerals, and I am not sure now, from the outside, which kind of surviving costs more. The Amish world gave me things I will always carry. A childhood so rooted in land and season and community that I have never once in my years outside it felt at home in a city. A knowledge of what it means to be held by people who know your grandmother's name. A faith that I have had to take apart piece by piece and put back together in my own shape. But that is still, even rebuilt, still mine. But there is no theology I believe in now that requires a mother to lose her children as the price of her conscience. There is no scripture that calls the separation of a mother from her children restoration. There is no God I have rebuilt my faith around who designed a woman with a mind that could say no, and then intended for her to be punished for using it. The order was not holy. It was convenient. And the difference between those two things is exactly the distance I have been walking for 31 years. If you grew up in a world where your obedience was the price of keeping your children close, I see you. If you have sat at a table that was your own table in your own house and felt yourself disappear from it, I see you. If you have watched your child turn to someone else with a question they used to bring to you, and you understood in that moment exactly what was being done and exactly how little you could do to stop it, I see you. If someone ever called your clarity pride and your steadiness disorder and your love for your children defiance, I see you. You are not wrong. You were the only one in the room who was right. And if no one in your world ever said that to you, I am saying it now. Write it down somewhere if you need to. Put it where you can find it on the days when you cannot remember it yourself. There is one more thing I want to say before I go. I have received messages from women who are still inside communities like the one I came from. Women who found this channel in the small hours of the morning, watching on a phone they keep in a drawer, in the light of a screen they would not be permitted to have if anyone knew. I want to speak directly to those women now. What you are feeling is not Hochmut. What you are feeling is the truth trying to find daylight. You are not disordered. You are not broken. You are a woman in a very small space, and the space is not the size you deserve. Leave me a comment. Tell me what surprised you, or what you recognized, or what you have never said out loud before today. I read every word. And if you want to keep hearing from behind the prayer cap, subscribe to Hannah the Amish Girl. There are so many more truths waiting to be said. The Sundays, what 20 minutes cannot hold. Link in the description and the pinned comment. The morning is yours if you decide it is. Until next time, choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save your life.